think it's very lovely that there is these informal opportunities, and kind of pivoting back to what we were talking about last week, but also that I would like you to start thinking about this week more specifically, is how a feminist classroom or a classroom about feminism becomes a site where you build community, alliance, solidarity. And you know, this goes back a little bit what we were talking about last week, you know, how you define feminism, no? And some of you expressed both last week, but also in your responses, a little bit of discomfort, you know, at taking on an identity that is feminist in terms of activism. But it doesn't have to be that a feminist goes out in the streets yelling slogans. Often, actually, that's more of a form of performance rather than a form of embracing an identity. And so finding opportunities to get together to talk, for example, about books that address directly and indirectly what it means to be, in the case of Shanghai Baby, an empowered woman, you know, not just in terms of one's affective identity, but also in terms of one's sexual identity, for example. That too can be a feminist site or a site of feminist engagement. Similarly, you know, we can look at this classroom and the people who are here as a place where you have an increasingly old professor that, you know, has gained experience teaching and, you know, reading and leading students in analytical and critical discussion, or, and that would be my preference, you know, and this is just a possibility for you, not a demand, or you can see it as your space, where I'm more kind of a facilitator, someone who opens the door and guides you through certain reflections, but that ultimately this is your space, you know, because I think, you know, so often we don't allow our students to make classrooms, especially beautiful classrooms such as this, their own. And I know I'm supposed to lecture, so I promise I will lecture, but especially because I have the microphone. But this is just an invitation for you to think about, you know, especially because last week we were talking about the meanings attached to feminisms, no? And so for all of our meetings, our lectures, but also our discussions, I encourage you to keep asking yourselves, what do I mean by feminism? And how do these readings that I've asked you, for example, to do for today, and also the conversations, how do they shape, engender, modify whatever each of you, and also myself, can mean by feminism? And maybe one thing that you can do, if you want to, is kind of keep a little diary of your key terms stemming from our time together, including feminism, no? So you can see where you begin and where you will end up. And just as a reminder, you know, these are the key questions I told you last week. I wanted us to think about and think with. Of course, I remind you, you know, even though I speak with an Italian accent, all the languages I speak, and I speak them all badly, you know, I do belong solidly intellectually within the US academic sphere. So I understand that some of these questions may not make that much sense within the German context. And again, having this slide here is an invitation for each of you to, having read these questions, maybe come up with your own questions. Now, what are the things that matter to you? Again, in this space that is your own space, ultimately. And just to remind you, this is something I put also in the PowerPoint PDF for last week, but just to remind you what we covered last Tuesday, and a kind of takeaway points that at least I hope you took away. Of course, you can take away a lot more, not just what it's on the screen. And, you know, the last point actually is very important, I think. And I just wanted to put it because, especially having done readings like Laura Bates' book about men who hate women, or, you know, dealing with systemic racism, lack of gender equity, you know, can be a little bit heavy, right? And so there is this tendency of associating any form of feminist engagement, not just with rabid feminists marching down the street, but also with really a profound emotional, political struggle. But I really want you to see that there are many opportunities, including activities like a book club, where you can have fun and you can talk openly about important issues in a way that inspires you rather than depresses you. Okay? So, feminisms. And let's just say for a moment, you know, so there are a variety of different positionalities. I thought it could be interesting for you to see what some of my students at this introductory course on feminism that I taught a few months ago wrote about their definition of feminisms. So you kind of meet other students like you know, trying to encounter. I mean, I will not spend much time on this. It's just so that after our meeting today, you can take time and go through the PDF and read what people like you on the other side of the ocean can say. One of my most favorite definitions is by the student named Maya, not you, but another Maya, which I think embraces this idea of active plurality that I would like to encourage all of us to play with and experiment, this idea of feminism as a verb. Now, this idea is something that active, that can be conjugated in many different ways, in many different tenses, in many different numbers, from singular to plural. But, you know, it's just something for you to think with as maybe you come up with your definition. And I also, and I hope, you know, you don't mind, I took a couple of definitions from some of your responses that I thought were quite inspiring, at least for me, that illustrate precisely what I was just saying, how, you know, one doesn't need to wear a big sign that says, I'm a feminist. You know, feminisms happens in acts of everyday life. And also, you know, how we all have our different ways to think about it. And so here, I just want to put some possibilities, and again, both inspired by your responses that I don't respond to, by the way, because I was told that that's Professor Mittler's job. So, but I still read all your responses so that you know. I want to also say it because I don't want you to think I'm like a voyeur and spying on your responses. But, you know, just so that you know. And you can see, and this is actually something I want to point out, we don't have much time in these meetings we have together to really move beyond the dance that feminism does between social, political, and gender identity and political identity. A very important part of feminist studies and feminist theory has to do with sexuality studies and queer theory. I decided not to really go there just because it feels very, how to say, unfair for me to squeeze something as important as the intersection of feminist studies and feminist theory and sexuality studies, but I'm always very happy to talk about it. So especially as we discuss in our Wednesday meetings, different materials, I'll try to bring that component out. But of course, you know, gender, intersectionality, and pushing back and against dualistic thought and binary thought and heteronormativity and amatonormativity is very important in feminist theory. Okay? Lastly, I wanted to, just because it's fun, talk where the word feminism comes from. Because we often, think, oh, okay, feminism, and that's what I was kind of trying to show you last week. There is a way in which the word feminism has become so completely mainstream. Now we find it everywhere, on mugs, on t-shirts, on wallets. But where does it really come? Of course, it comes from the Latin, like most. Now, you'll think it's because my Italian pride. Not really. Though I did study Latin for 8 years, but that's another story. Femina, means female. And ism is that very problematic ending, no? Because it usually has a very pejorative connotation. So, but let's say that it doesn't have the pejorative connotation. And it's a word that even though doesn't appear until the 19th century, starts to be seen and read retroactively in the works of these famous activists and authors like Mary Wilson Wollcraft, or this very sour-looking guy, Charles Fouillet. And this, in many ways, this is kind of what I was telling you last week, this kind of linear teleological history of feminism that is very Euro-American focused. And we have supposedly the inventor of the word feminist, this Hubertine Auclair, who invented this term to refer to herself and to the nascent suffragette movement in France. So, though from today onwards, especially, but already last week, we were critiquing very heavily the white stream feminist stance that it's common to Euro-American feminism. It's important for us to recognize how all this history and all these kind of words that we use to talk about what we want to talk about have a very heavy loaded history. Does this make sense? Sorry, it's good exercise for me to move around. Okay. So, from today onwards also, we're moving more directly towards academic discourses about feminism. I still wanted to ask you to read an author like Zaccaria, who's not within academia. No? She's an investigative journalist, an intellectual, an activist, but she's not located or situated within the Anglophone academic world, unlike Sarah Mead was for most of her life. Well, she's very young, so for part of her life. But I thought that maybe beginning with the general mainstream discourses, as we did last week, would help you see, for example, like an investigative journalist like Laura Bates, what she wrote about. So we have these voices, and Zaccaria is still one of them, that are quite actively engaging issues of racial inequality and discrimination within mainstream white feminist discourse. But with Sarah Mead, and going forward for our lectures, we will be working mostly with academics and feminist academics, so that you can kind of see what is the balance and the differences in engagements. And this is just for you to kind of have a map. Now, had any of you heard of Zaccaria before taking this course, or of her book? well, I suppose maybe it wasn't translated in German. Yes, she's quite famous. You know, she has a very high profile, and she's actually, I mean, quite a few of her books have to do with her own life journeys, especially her very first book, Life Journey as someone who was set up in an arranged marriage to a man much older, and then she had to escape her marriage because of domestic abuse. She spent a great deal of time in a shelter for battered women, and she wrote about it, you know, and that's when she switched it to activist journalist writing. And so, at least in the Anglophone, she's a very prominent voice. And her book, Against White Feminism, when it came out, was actually a very powerful moment of reckoning for all sorts of, and especially in the United States, I think, because there is the tendency to think that it's only black feminists or African American women who are being discriminated against in the US. And Zaccaria, with this book especially, kind of took on the job of educating Anglophone audiences about what happens to other BIPOC women, meaning other women of color, no? Black, indigenous people of color. That's the acronym. Sorry, sometimes I have to remind myself that maybe you're not up on your US acronyms. So if there is something I say that makes no sense to you, please stop me and say, hey, what does that mean? Because, so in a way, and forgive me for opening a little bit of a history window, what I ask you to read for today, now these excerpts from Against White Feminists, or White Feminism, sorry, not Against White Women. That's a very interesting lapsus, but we will not linger. So, so what Zaccaria writes about, in many ways, had already been put forward by what is usually called the second wave feminists in the US and in Anglophone. Especially black feminists, like, for example, the Combahee River Collective that we will discuss, I think, next week, and also, you know, the kind of the third world women of color feminists that really start to activate and organize in the late 60s and early 70s in the US, scholars and activists like Gloria Anzaldúa, who wrote this bridge called My Back. I don't know if that rings any bells for any of you. Also, of course, Audre Lorde, that we will discuss. Teresa H.K. Cha, a Korean-American artist and activist. Cherry Moraga. You know, so in many ways, what's interesting is that all of these second and third wave feminist activists of color who wrote about many of the issues that Zaccaria writes about were completely forgotten. And so when this book came out, it caused a huge uproar. And so I thought that maybe it could be interesting for you to be exposed to it. And then there is Sara Ahmed, who's my hero. Reading this book, actually reading all of her books, changed completely my life. Sometimes not always for the better. You know, living a feminist life was actually, and I think this is something, you know, if you want to read the whole book, you know, which is why I usually upload the entire books for you, so you can, if you want to, aside from the few pages I ask you to read, you can kind of have a picture of the whole book. Living a feminist life can be both empowering and quite upsetting, I think, because she maps out how often there is this sense of profound isolation and loneliness in people, so not just women. She happens to identify as a woman, a queer woman, and a queer woman of color. But this doesn't mean that it's only queer women of color that can live feminist lives. But I think she identifies those moments when one is made to feel different, broken, imperfect in very powerful ways. And that, I think, can be quite upsetting for some of us. I remember reading the first pages of this book and crying like a broken faucet, we say in Italian. So I just, so that you know, or maybe you've already encountered this experience. So who is Sara Ahmed? Sara Ahmed used to be an academic and worked in both in Australia and the UK as an academic. And then after a long and prolonged battle to have a certain faculty who were harassing and discriminating both herself and other colleagues, she decided that it wasn't worthy anymore for her to be in racist institutions and decided to become an independent scholar. And so since one of the tensions that we will keep going back to is the tension between feminism as a theoretical concept, as an object of study, and feminism as identity, especially as social political identity, as identity of activism, I thought her work could be inspiring. She's very active. She has a blog called Feminist Killjoys that I encourage you to look at, where she talks about exactly what we're talking about. You know, it's not that her feminism is the only feminism possible, but I thought she could be an interesting person for you to think with. So let me pause for a moment. Any questions so far? Anything that you want to ask are unclear? So far, so good. Speak now or forever hold your peace. No, just kidding. 开玩笑. Okay, so let us turn to Zachariah's book and the pages I asked you to read. Do you have any questions about them? Things that struck you or even were unclear as you were reading the pages or the part of the book? Yes, Zafei.
Oh, I get this microphone as well. Okay, when I was reading the pages, I had this question in mind. If she's talking about against white feminism, then what is the subject? Is it I am against feminism or we are against white feminism? Who is this subject that she's referring to? And then I can see that she has independently published this book. So I was wondering when I was reading if she was writing it with an audience in mind. Because based on the language, based on the word choices, and based on the way she communicates with this potential audience, I could see that perhaps it's not specifically targeting at an academic audience, but to the general public. And I think she has done that quite amazingly. But maybe this I or we question will connect her writing to Sara Ahmed's book as well. Sara Ahmed was trying to point out that when we talk about feminism, it's very important for us to figure out who are we fighting for. And she also brings up this question of who we are. So I think through their writings, both of their writings, I was just wondering, is there a common identity for feminists? Is there not? And are there any overlappings between white feminism and non-white feminism, and is there any possibility for us to actually work together and cultivate an environment of not just solidarity but also sympathy and empathy?
This is a little bit more than one question. No, I can't. I joke, sorry, because it's good to be a little bit silly at times, but these are all wonderful questions. But you're right that in a way it is one question, right? It's about identity. Who is the author really, and who is she writing for? And I think you're absolutely right, and that's a very beautiful way to bring together not just these two readings, but all the readings that we will do together, including the ones that we did before. And I don't know if anyone wants to add to this question that Zefei raised, or you had other questions related or related to this question of the identity and the singularity or the plurality of the author's voice and the audience. Silence. I know it's very scary to be put on the spot, but then maybe let's use your questions, Zefei, to kind of think a little bit more in depth about Zacharias' work for a moment. Then we'll move to Ahmed. For sure, and that's why I wanted you to read these pages. For sure, she's writing for a very specific audience. And she's writing for all those BIPOC women, mostly, who see their histories, their voices erased. So it is an activist stance that she takes and claims for herself. And this is why I was telling you a little bit about her personal life. I do think that this act of writing as an activist for a community that she feels strongly is consistently erased, underrepresented, whose history is consistently eliminated and marginalized, no? Doesn't appear in history books. Because in many ways, the pages I asked you to read are all about history. History of people who are not seen and recognized as having one. So she takes this activist stance, but for sure, it is also her personal history. So this I is at once singular and collective. I don't know, this is not an easy way to avoid to answer the question, and I think that is why this is such a powerful text in many ways, because it is, and especially if you read the whole book, but even I know maybe you'll say it's not just few pages that you asked us to read. I think I asked you to read about 50 pages, so maybe that's not so few. But for sure, there is this movement, this dance between the I of the author who feels so strongly about this lack of representation and the collectivity of the audience in which the author identifies. And this is in many ways very, and that's why I think your question is framed very beautifully. It's also really the case for living a feminist life and for most of Ahmed's writing, because you will see, and I don't know if you notice anything about the style of Ahmed's prose, but she will often put I. She talks about her experience at the family dinner table. That's when actually I cried, because I was like, this is my life. That's what happened to me at the dinner table. And so in many ways, clearly I'm not a BIPOC person. So, and this is the second part of your question. So how do we create solidarity? Through recognizing the intersectionality of our identities. And we'll spend a lot of time on intersectionality, but really this idea that even if we don't all share the experience, for example, of being racially discriminated against, we can share the experience of, for example, of being read as a feminist killjoy, someone who doesn't have the power, for example, to speak back when their voices are silenced. someone who can be made fun of or whose feelings can be trivialized at the dinner table in a classroom like this. So that's where you can create solidarity. You can also create solidarity and community across differences. And this is something that comes beautifully evident. And I think maybe some of you may have seen this documentary. There is a documentary called Audre Lorde, The Berlin Years, 1991 to 1994. Okay, the years I may get wrong, but the title of the documentary is correct. And there is a moment where Audre Lorde, who was coming to Germany to teach at the Free University of Berlin, is sitting in a classroom, not as beautiful as this, but a classroom, with a group of German students, some of whom were Afro-German students, and they're talking in English about what it means to be a feminist and who gets to determine who's a feminist. And then at a certain moment, Audrey looks around the room and says, and now I would like to ask all the students who are not Afro-German to leave. Because now I need to talk to my sisters who are black, who share experiences with me that none of the Caucasian students share. And I think to me that is a very powerful moment because it can be read like, okay, this is someone excluding, classmates, students from a communal space of learning. But if you read this gesture from the perspective of Audre Lorde, who was intersectional in her poetry, in her scholarship, in her teaching, in her activism, you recognize it as a moment where she embraced the fact there was a need for a space for these Afro-German students to be able to speak about their challenges in ways that would not have been possible otherwise. So you will say, and how does this answer my question, especially in the light of Ahmed and Zacharia's scholarship? It does because there are times that it's important to recognize that we don't all share the same experiences. And processing and embracing those differences is also part of creating a feminism that engenders solidarity and understanding. Especially because so often, and this is where Zacharia's work is important, for people who take for granted that racism no longer exists, and usually those people are white or Caucasian, it's important to experience what it means to be told that they don't belong in certain spaces. And that can also generate knowledge, painful as it may be. And part of what both Ahmed and Zakaria have to teach us is that too often a positionality that centers whiteness as the default human positionality is taken as universal. And so the recognition of the fact that intersectionally we all experience access to education, access to reproductive justice, access to socioeconomic advancement differently based on our different identities, that is the key message, I would say, of these works. Does this make sense? Sorry, yes, Barbara.
To me, it's really disturbing because we're in transforming steps here, right? And we are trying to see that, yes, people are creating borders and identity making in the way that these people are doing it, right? Is basically creating borders, right? Saying that, I'm like this and I'm therefore
in an in-group with others who are like me, and be they black, be they whatever, it sort of makes them it makes them part of this in-group, right? And thereby I exclude others. But what we're learning in transcultural studies is that this in-grouping, right, as an act, is an act that can keep changing, right? So every single being can be part of, that's what intersectionality is all about, right? Can be part of all kinds of different types of in-groups. And so I'm really wondering, why do we have to be so, because they are confrontational, to write against whatever, right? And, there have been books, I think that asking about the subject, this is actually part of a story of intertextuality. There are so many books against theory, against whatever, right? And so the subject isn't really the main thing. But exactly, to go against means that I'm excluding, right? And the transcultural perspective really tries to rearrange that necessity to exclude, right? And to make us think in ways where we understand why people need to exclude from time to time, right? To have a certain type of experience, for example. But it seems to me not the best way to do scholarship after all. And anyway, so not a scolding, but an invitation.
First of all, yes, thank you for this, Professor Midler. First of all, as I said, Zaccaria is not an academic, right? So she's not creating or trying to engage issues from an intellectual or academic perspective. I think, we need to read more. Of course, we read and discuss what I fished out for you. And it's always painful, not to excerpt. I'm sure we're all in agreement that it's always painful out of a whole book that engenders a very fierce debate to pick one little part. So I think the perspective here is, there are a few things to keep in mind. First of all, Zaccaria is not trying to create a new academic trend. She is here in this interview with the LA Times, she's saying, precisely answering this question that it was also partially what Zefei was asking. She's saying, it's kind of a call to arms or like an invitation. I would say it's more of a provocation, but often when you're marginalized, and this has to do more with activism and not creating sites of exclusions, when you're marginalized, you need to raise your voice to be heard. And this is also where this idea of the feminist killjoy emerges. That if there is always no place for you at the table, how do you enter that space, especially academia? Also, nowhere in their writing, that's why maybe, again, it's my fault for choosing these experts, there is a static idea, or also in Audre Lorde, there is never a sense that you exclude others and you create an in-group that is always the same. Because as you were saying, intersectionality is all about becoming, right? This constant rethinking, reworking of what it means to be a feminist, how you create spaces of feminist learning and engagement. So it's the opposite, actually, of in-groups and out-groups. I was making the example, and I'll try to show you the clip or make it available so you can see it, of a moment which is a teachable moment, but it's a moment of years of teaching that Audre Lorde did without ever excluding anybody, but creating moments where there can be a space that feels safe. Because I don't know all of you, but I can bet there are things that some of you would feel comfortable talking about, for example, only with people who identify as women, and others that would feel comfortable talking about only with people who identify as queer. And then other cases with people who, there are things that maybe, for example, I'm a survivor of sexual violence. There are things that I do think in certain moments I can talk about only to other people who have had that experience. But not because I want to have these static in and out groups. Yes.
I hope I'm not speaking too much. When I was reading this book against white feminism, I put down notes. I said, this is showing a great lack of concerns regarding intersectionality. And then I started to think, why is she doing so? And I totally agree with you, Professor. It could be a very strategic stance that she's taking. I've had numerous conversations about feminism with my friends, and I feel like it's very hard for me to be a feminist. I'm ashamed to admit it, because I'm always trying to think in the shoes of others. As I'm trying to be a scholar, I'm always trying to figure out, how about the white feminists in the wine club? Maybe they are trying to understand. Maybe Zafar, I hope I'm saying her name right, is being too self-conscious. And I'm trying to analyze the situation from multiple standpoints. But then I figure out, perhaps by doing so, the ones who are afraid to speak are even more marginalized. So it could be a very strategic standpoint she's taking here to make something to us so not, I would say, scholarly, or showing not enough concern towards intersectionality. And then I was also trying to figure out, why is she not speaking up? And I hope I can share a story here. I moved to Heidelberg a few years ago as an international student, and I was very eager to figure out how to fit in. So I joined a migration nonprofit organization. At that organization, all the other people were all BIPOC. They were not first-generation migrants. They all were born in Germany, so they were perfect in German. I was trying to figure out how I can contribute to the discussions regarding mobility and immobility. And I figured out that I could never speak up. I just felt this intense pressure, and I felt guilty for asking them to include me by speaking English. And in the end, I left the group. And then when I was reading this piece, I recorded the story of my own. Perhaps sometimes it's difficult to speak the language, not just the language of the country, but the language of the activist organization, or the language of feminists. Perhaps the white feminists have a different system of language, a system of jargon, that this writer is having difficulty to identify with. And she's trying to use a different language to speak to a different audience who share the same trauma. Just to add on to this very stimulating conversation.
Yeah, no, these are all incredibly important points, and I'm sure, and that's why I think this is fantastic that you feel empowered to speak here. For sure, each of us has stories like this, of moments where you feel you can stand up or you cannot. And also, I want to emphasize that this is a form of learning about your own positionality and becoming aware of your own positionality. In many ways, that may lead you to say, well, feminism is not for me, activism is not for me, I just don't speak that language. So what we're doing here, and the reason why I ask you to read these authors, is not to turn you into rabid feminists, is to show you the different positionalities and the challenges. And for some, the best path forward could be transcultural studies or different paths. But for sure, what these two authors are asking us to think with is to critically look at legacies of white articulations of subjectivity that even centuries later have a great impact on how people of all genders, of all sexual orientations, of all different backgrounds feel or don't feel empowered to speak up. And this is, I think, what we can take away, especially as we move then forward to read what Jennifer Nash has to say about intersectionality. And I don't know, again, if any of you has read her work, but based on what we discussed today, and sorry, oh, we're 1 minute over time. So let me wrap it up. Based on what we discussed today, what Jennifer Nash does in her book, Beyond Intersectionality, is to really ask ourselves how we can work with a key analytic like intersectionality if through theoretical discourse it becomes static and becomes exactly what Professor Mittler was talking about, you know, this way to say, if you're a black feminist activist, then you can talk about intersectionality, but if you aren't, then it's not up to you. And Jennifer Nash wrote a whole book against this stance, which unfortunately is also a common stance in US academic discourse about feminism. So let's conclude here. You know, in the slides for today's gathering, there are lots of quotes that you can look at and think with a little bit, especially for those of you who want to write a response. But even if you don't, just keep these questions and these tensions in mind, because I think it's very important for you to keep pushing against the boundaries of what these authors are saying. And the last thing I will say, and then I promise I'll be quiet, so you can go out and enjoy this lovely day again, is that the reason why I assign these authors is not because I think they're the best authors or the ones that articulate this idea the best, but as I said, in the case of Zakaria, her book generated a lot of conversation within and outside academia, and so it was a good bridge to bring us into academia. In the case of Ahmed, she was an academic, she left academia, so she's also modeling an example for some people who may feel like, I don't belong in academia, so where do I go? So she became an independent scholar. And then we will keep talking about these issues. I don't want to give you any fixed answers. So it's not my job to tell you this is the path that you need to walk. I just want to introduce you to some authors that can help you think in expansive ways. Okay? So off you go, enjoy the lovely weather, and I'll see you, I think, tomorrow. Alice. Oh, yes, sorry. There is 2 screenings. Tonight, Professor Mittler.
That's why we don't have the film, because he's bringing the film actually on his computer, and you know he'll be here. He'll be around from 17:30 onwards. So you know, look out for him.
Yes.
Anyway, and Come Big is his new film, 2023 film, which is on a sad topic because it's on children who have cancer, but how to deal with it. So in a way.
But then, if you're sad after watching the film tonight, come to the film tomorrow, The Postmodern Life of My Aunt, and you have screening guides for each of the movie on Moodle, so you can just check them out, okay? And now you're free to go. Thank you very much.